Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. And we're also streaming today on our guests' platform as well, Adnan Hussein. So, Adnan, I'm going to go ahead and bring you to the stage so that we can kind of co-host this. But good to collaborate with you again, my friend. I had a lot of, learned a lot. I always say I had a lot of fun, and it's like we're talking about this really horrible stuff. like, but so fun isn't the right word, but I do find all of this, I think it's information that we need to think about and learn about history and ideology that obviously impacts our world. And very often I think, and we could talk about this partly in our conversation, I think on the left, sometimes we can be dismissive of, the power of ideas that are from a kind of mystical, what's the word, metaphysical, space, and the impact that they have on our material world, which of course, Marx understood that, right? As much as anybody. And so I think it's really important for us to actually dig into these things and also talk about the materialist foundations of them, talk about them together, talk about the ideas and the material, and talk about the spiritual. And so the last time we talked about the Crusades and thinking about the historical Crusades, but also kind of your work or your idea around a crusading society and the West and the United States, and how the Crusades kind of maybe offer a model or a framework through which these imperialist structures kind of move through the world and relate specifically to the so-called Middle East or the Levant region, and I mean, I should do a little bit of an introduction for my platform, but just to say that you're a professor, you're a professor of history, religion as well, right? Looking at Islam, looking at Christianity, looking at Judaism. And you have a great show that you've been running on YouTube, the Adnan Hussein Show, which you've had these struggle sessions. People should be checking those out. Obviously, today, Sina just put out the latest Tanky Group Therapy, which we were on together. We recorded on Sunday. And then, of course, a lot of our listeners and viewers will know you from Guerrilla History podcast as well.
That's right.
So yeah, shout out to Guerrilla History and Henry and Brett, his time there. Yeah, absolutely, all the good work that you all have done. So today we kind of wanted to delve into Christian Zionism and talk a little bit about their relationship to settler colonialism. Obviously, it's just such an interesting thing. I think many of us are familiar with this idea now of, that there's this thing called Christian Zionism. It's certainly, while we're familiar with it, I think we also study it less rigorously, it feels like to me, than we study, Zionism as it relates to Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously they both relate to Israel, but I guess, Jewish Zionism, right, would be the term. But there's a lot of, conservative Christians, Christian fundamentalists and different groups. Ted Cruz is like a prominent example of this, that fall into this kind of broad ideology. And like Morgan Archukina has pointed out to me, like this is a much larger demographic around the world, actually, Christian Zionists are, than even Jewish people. And so it's a really important thing for us to understand. And so I kind of wanted to go back and talk about where this movement came from first, because I think we can also make the mistake of thinking that it arrives around the same time as, Theodor Herzl and this kind of Zionism, or that it maybe is a reaction to that, or
Mm-hmm.
a way of finding an ideology that, kind of reaches similar interests. But that's not the case. It starts much earlier than that. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about kind of when it came about and some of the important doctrine within this ideology.
Yeah, and just also thank you so much for organizing and hosting this, and for allowing Adnan Hussein show listeners, watchers, also to participate and get this live. And everybody who's watching on any of my platforms or channels should like, uh, share, and subscribe to Millennials or Killing Capitalism. Um,
And vice versa, please. I mean, I know that we've been in the YouTube streets a little longer than you have, Adnan,
yeah,
as your show's pretty recent, and I'm sure that you're putting out great content every week, and so people should be subscribed to you as well. One other plug I wanted to do that I forgot is also tomorrow on the Red Nation,
yes.
Nick Estes and Justin Potter are going to be having a conversation that I think is going to be more focused around some of the biblical scripture, which we'll probably talk about today, and genocide, but and settler colonialism. I think that'll be a great discussion too that people will definitely want to tune into.
Yeah, I definitely was going to reference it at some point, that I'm sure they'll be talking about some of the things, but in greater depth. And I think they've titled that stream or show, program, the Book of Genocide, which is almost a necessary title. I mean, that's begging to be made there, Book of Genesis. Although I would say that most of what we think of as the genocidal content, and especially if we get into discussion of the key words that were signaled at the outset of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza after, October 7th, and these characterizations of Palestinians as Amalek. We'll go back to scripture and be covering some of that ground. But I have to say, I'm so glad to be back on, and I do think that you were right in some ways to frame the previous conversation that we had about the Crusades, because if you want to understand the roots of Christian Zionism, I don't think it is a very recent phenomenon. Of course, it takes many shapes and different forms over time, because all of these ideologies or theologies and religious cultures and orientations themselves are susceptible, despite the way religion and ideology always tries to portray and represent itself as an unchanging set of doctrinal truths about the world, that they are actually very susceptible to history, to the material conditions as they're perceived and apprehended, and ideologies or religious traditions, or particular doctrinal and theological orientations, um, are successful only if they manage to find ways to capture concerns and questions and problems that are relevant to the people at their time. And so they are always changing and developing. But I think it is important and valuable to, Edward Said always talked about, I mean, he had a methodological kind of approach that we shouldn't search for origins, but we have to think about and be conscious of beginnings. Where do we start our story? And the way that you start the story and where you start it, how you do, kind of tends to frame the rest of the narrative and has consequences for analysis. So very often, either it's looked at as biblical, so like Zionism will, make use of biblical text and scripture and prophecy there and say, well, this is the origins of this, ideology, this claim, this, kind of commitment. And likewise, a lot of Christians and Christian Zionists will go back to the so-called origins of this in God's promise to, Israel, to the people described in those historical books, particularly the Pentateuch, the 5 books that are attributed to Moses that deal with the early Hebrews, before the establishment, or in the kind of context as a kind of foundation story for later biblical scripture and books during the era of the Jewish kingdom. So, and even those later books are looking back to earlier kind of episodes. And so there's this kind of search for origins. And we could do that, and we probably will need to go back and look at some scripture. But the way I look a problem that a lot of people, and I think both people who are skeptical or believe in religion, tend to misuse and abuse scripture and lose historical consciousness, even if they're materialist sorts of analysts, is that they look to scripture and then they take it as reality that, okay, well, for the theological imagination is real because God said so and it's God's words. And of course, it has enduring, eternal relevance. And even those who, of course, dismiss it as like, a construct or, and have instead a materialist, analysis, they tend to look at religion as a very simplistic phenomenon, cultural factors as really epiphenomenal to these deeper underlying structures. And I agree with them. I mean, I think ideology and all of that is very reflective of the underlying material conditions, but they're not reduced to, and they operate in a sophisticated way that requires really understanding. I think that's also particularly the case for religion, that if you just go back and read supposedly what scripture says, and I'm not even talking about all the difficulties of translation and the textual history of all these things in the form that we have them now, that make it questionable whether you can just read like read my Oxford study Bible that I pulled out to make sure that in case we, go back to it, that whatever this modern translation, says is somehow, reflective of the consciousness of the people at the time, or is how sometimes that isn't even relevant. What's important is how have people understood it, interpreted it, with what kind of mental universe and framework related to what contemporary social, political, and historical conditions. But so you have to take that into account and see, okay, how was this then relevant to the way people framed their world and may have affected them, their behavior, their psychology, the decisions that they make, that are in dynamic and dialectical relationship over time with material conditions and histories that are also changing. So they're both changing, is my point. And very often we think of religion as an unchanging set of doctrines and ideas rooted in some canonical scriptural text. And we don't account for the fact that the religious cultures in which people really inhabit with meaning are constantly being revised because they interpret these things differently. They see them so differently. Sometimes they see things in ways that are absolute contradictions of how one would look at the text, or that there are contradictory things in these texts and they emphasize one over another. And then some people try and say, oh, well, that's just error. That's just, heresy. And I think that's just a very simplistic, sort of way. And this has been used, I think, in a vicious sort of way by Orientalism, for example, like, in a much more, this is all on a different kind of angle of it, but the idea that Muslims could be reduced to and understood through an unchanging, adherence to a doctrinal set of propositions in their holy scripture or early extra scriptural and interpretive texts, and anything that deviates from that is, some kind of like, well, they're not really Muslims, or they're not following what Islam says. So, even if they say they're about peace and all that, well, look, these verses are about war. And so, hey, they're just not following their own religion, or they're lying about it, or they're hiding. And it's a part of their nefarious duplicity, as part of their grand strategy to replace us and take over West. So you can, that same kind of logic of like, you can only and you must understand people just through these texts rather than the contexts, the history, actually has a pernicious idea, kind of force, especially when it's yoked to ideas about peoples without history and that they're unchanging. And the West changes and develops, and it has this phenomenology of spirit, and it's actually history, whereas everybody else is sort of imprisoned in their cultural and religious prism and unchanging. And these are kinds of ideas that, as Edward Said pointed out, are very important in colonial ideologies and racist, sorts of ideologies. And so I would put that we have to put religion in the same dynamic, complex sort of context when we're looking at it. And so that was like a long kind of, I don't know, methodological excursus to say that I think one of the places for beginnings for me that's very fruitful for thinking about Christian Zionism and its development and its legacies is actually to think about the Crusades as a departure itself from earlier eras of Christian interpretation and understanding of salvation history, of like what is the saved community's kind of place in this unfolding of history, and who's on the outside and what's their role. And of course, the Jews were among the peoples on the outside, and they had a particular role, and that a role originally had been established for them in this supersessionist kind of Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, that was replaced. And those people, the chosen people who were the subject of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, were replaced by the saved community that is the church, and that Zion, Jerusalem, Israel, these biblical references to it in the Old Testament had to be understood allegorically as referring to and prophesying the true saved community that would come as a result of Jesus's crucifixion and his status as the Messiah who was expected among the Jews. And it's the mistaking and refusing to accept that historical kind of fact in salvation history, i.e., theology and interpretation of the Bible, that then rendered them sort of outside of history. So now, and that it happened to coincide very conveniently, it seemed, for Christian commentators in the patristic era, it happened to, coincide with the the Roman destruction of the Second Temple and the so-called dispersal of the Jews. That is the era where they call being in galut or exile. And that is really the foundations, in some ways, of, you could say, what Judaism became for the next 2 millennia, or 1900 years or 1850 or 70 years. We'll get to that, of like we are dispersed in exile, and the restoration of the Jews will come about through the Messiah. However, still waiting for that, but Christians saying it already happened, they just missed it because it didn't happen in an earthly manner with the reestablishment of a Jewish kingdom and a physical temple, but rather the idea that Jesus was the temple, was the tabernacle, and that he was the Messiah, but not to bring about the earthly restoration of Jerusalem and of the kingdoms of Israel on this plane, but the heavenly Jerusalem, i.e., salvation. And so it's a new era, in history, that supersedes the previous historical interpretation of those books of the Bible and the prophecies, that might be there, right? And the promises and the covenants. So, then it's a whole different theology, but it's this allegorical on several levels, but an allegorical perspective. So, but then what to do about the Jews? What's their role? They've been kind of punished for not, seeing the truth that the Messiah actually had already come. And so, what is their kind of role in Christian salvation history? What role do they play in this story, as they are outside of history as a kind of political community? They are just a kind of religious, kind of carryover or leftover of the previous dispensation. So what's their role? And this is where Augustine, a very foundational and important, the Bishop of Hippo, an early church father, he writes his Confessions. Some people may have read this about his own conversion and progress from paganism to Manichaeanism to, converting to Christianity. But he also wrote a very important book, City of God. And he also wrote another important book, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine. And in those, he was really dealing with big questions of salvation history. And he came up with a sort of theological approach to how to understand the Jews. The Jews were dispersed throughout the world. And in fact, it was very important that they were dispersed like everywhere in the world. Every corner of the world, there were Jews who served a very important function, that although they couldn't see the true allegorical and spiritual meaning of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament that they carried around, they kept it and preserved it as living witnesses and testimonies to the truth of Christianity, because even though they couldn't see it, anybody with a spiritual temperament would be able to recognize that, of course, the binding of Isaac is just a prophecy and a prefiguration of the crucifixion of Christ, right? So they had this whole, that they're so obvious, these kind of relationships between, the Old Testament and what was happening in the New Testament, a whole kind of spiritual allegorical reading that Augustine thought was so obvious to anybody, if you actually looked at it, that clearly the fact that they couldn't see it meant that they were just sort of there to demonstrate that the Christians didn't make it up. Like the Jews keep it. They may not believe it, but everyone else can see that we didn't just sort of invent this idea of like the Messiah coming or the redemptive sacrifice, or, all these things of Christian doctrine as they developed them. They thought like, well, this is the proof and the evidence that they are witnesses, but they should not be harmed, like slay them not, he says, quoting one of the Psalms, but they should be subjected to Christians, and serve Christians and be, humiliated. And it became an absolute doctrine in the Adversus Judaeus Christian polemical tradition that there could be no reconstitution of Jewish political power, right? They couldn't basically come back into history understood as the, fate of nations and political units and kings and all that. They couldn't come back to history. They would never, after this dispersal, come back into history, except at the end of times. There might be an opportunity. And here is where Christian Zionism starts to kind of develop in its various forms. That there would be the conversion of the Jews at the end of time. So when they no longer needed, with the second coming of Christ at the end of time, as part of the battle against Antichrist and so forth, there would be no more need essentially for them to serve as witnesses, but they would actually be eradicated as a separate religious community, and they would either be killed in these end times in Armageddon, or they would convert to true Christianity. And so you have this kind of vision of salvation history that was Augustine's doctrine, that said, basically, this isn't imminent, and so for the time being, Jews will just serve Christians, and they'll serve as this proof and witness of the truth, the universal truth of Christianity, wherever they go and carry their books. That was the prevailing kind of idea. And it was the idea that the church sort of replaced it, and that it was a spiritual Jerusalem. As Anselm, Bishop of Canterbury, was an important kind of philosophical and theological thinker at the time of the Crusades, said when the Crusades began, it's like, what are all these people going off to go to Jerusalem for? Jerusalem is not this earthly city in Palestine. Why should we care about that? It's Jerusalem is in our hearts. It's in our spirit. It's the kingdom of heaven. It's what is taking place in the monasteries through prayers, creating the spiritual Jerusalem. Why are they all after this? But what happened, what he was witnessing, is that there was a change in the kind of dominant form of Christianity with the preaching of the Crusades, with this movement that materialized the spiritual Jerusalem back into this kind of idea that the actual place would matter. This is where the whole idea of the Holy Land gets invented. Nobody was talking about the Holy Land in this sort of way, but penitential pilgrimage had begun in earlier centuries. Jerusalem ended up becoming the most kind of glamorous and spiritually rewarding and most difficult of pilgrimages, and it started to develop devotion to the actual place where Jesus died, etc. But what it became was a materializing of the idea that we, as a special community and a church and a community of faithful, that replaced the Israelites, the Hebrews from that previous biblical tradition, now actually have themselves a claim to that land as inheritors of Jesus. And we had the whole discussion about the Crusades, so I don't want to go too much into that. But the one really important thing as a connection between what you might say is biblical kinds of interpretation is look at the end of there's many versions of Pope Urban II's preaching of the Crusades in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, late in November, so the end of the year, held this council, and he gives this sermon and announces taking taking up the cross and going, for remission of sins that you've confessed. It will be a penitential kind of act to go. You'll receive forgiveness, and to take the Holy Land, and to save Eastern Christians. So it's a kind of, has multiple kinds of values and ways of trying to articulate why it would be so beneficial, including there were plans even under Pope Gregory the Seventh, his previous pope with whom Urban II was kind of aligned and was sort of a follower and continuator of this reformed papacy, had kind of started really developing this idea of maybe we should help Byzantium. We could kind of create a kind of concept of holy war. We could take back something that now we're starting to think of and characterize as a holy land. We could unite and overcome some of the divisions between kind of imperial power of the Holy Roman emperors and their claims to precedence, saying, hey, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, listen to us, we're above. And the Pope saying, no, we have sort of kind of precedence in legitimating Christian governance and Christian polities without our approbation, without our kind of making of bishops. You can't just get these administrators and appoint your own bishops and think, no, we have precedence. But there was this rivalry called the investiture controversy that kind of was, established Christian political power versus the spiritual power of the leader of the church and inheritor of apostolic, kind of from St. Peter and all of this. There was, a real tension, a real battle in the sort of division that could be healed. The schism that had happened between the Eastern Roman Church and the Western or Latin Roman Christian Church in 1054, the so-called schism, that's something that could be healed by going and, helping Byzantium. And then, of course, the final sort of geopolitical accomplishment would be in taking back Jerusalem, is also to rid of the kind of, of the Saracens, of the Muslims. And so you had kind of like a full-on sort of spiritual and geopolitical, you could say, way that this call for the crusade comes together. But how is it announced? I'll just stop here with this, and then we can maybe talk a little bit more about this. Is that in one of the many versions of his speech, Archbishop Baldric or Baudry of Dole, which is actually, I think, one of the most interesting of the versions of the speech. And, I'd love to talk more about it. He covers all these crazy themes of responsibility to protect, and the holy fire is there. And we should, this idea of kind of really sacralizing the land, this new kind of concept of it as Palestine as the Holy Land. He says at the end, as a sort of conclusion of it, is, moreover, you who are to go shall have us praying for you. We shall have you fighting for God's people. It is our duty to pray, yours to fight against the Amalekites. With Moses, we shall extend unwearied hands in prayer to heaven while you go forth and brandish the sword like dauntless warriors against Amalek. So he identified at the very conclusion as a sort of the rousing, okay, now let's go out there and we'll be praying for you, is identifying the Muslims, the Saracens, the inhabitants of Palestine, now this holy land that actually belongs to us, are the Amalekites, right? And they, of course, that is the reference to the biblical people, one among many that the Israelites, the Hebrews, had to compete against and fight against in, their struggle to kind of rationalize and project backward from the period where they had the Jewish kingdoms. How it is that they came to rule here is because they defeated the Philistines, the Midianites, the Amorites, and the Amalekites. And the Amalekites have a particular and unique and special role. The episode that he's speaking of is their kind of earliest appearance in any, kind of significant way, which is, of course, during the period in Exodus where, the Israelites have left Egypt. They're being led by Moses, but, not always listening to him. And there's always these kind of conflicts happening, and he's complaining about them and so on. Is that at one point they were attacked in the wilderness by the Amalekites, and Moses gives instruction to someone named Joshua, who appears kind of at that point in the narrative. We haven't really heard very much about him up to that point, but somebody named Joshua to be the kind of military leader of the Israelites and to organize an attack upon them in Exodus. What is it? It's Exodus. I forget exactly the passage, but it's here it is. Okay. Yeah, it's in. No, that's Samuel. So it's in Exodus where he says, that you have to blot them out, right? Like, it's like the first kind of occasion for this sort of genocidal sort of point, which is that you have to blot out the memory of them under heaven. And this is sort of a phrase that's repeated kind of later on again. It's Deuteronomy. It's Exodus 17. Exodus 17 verses 8 to 16. So at the end of this kind of after they've been attacked, and Moses like goes up to the top of a hill while Joshua is fighting the Amalekites and holds his arms up in prayer for the victory, but sometimes his hands get tired, and so they drop down. And they notice that at that point, the Amalekites seem to kind of be on the offensive and doing well and starting to overwhelm them. And so Aaron and somebody else, I forget, Aaron and Hur kind of get on either side of him and prop his arms up so that they stay raised up in prayer. And eventually by nightfall, Joshua has obliterated at least the attack of these Amalekites, who are not completely destroyed. They do appear later several times, in biblical history, but this is the beginning of this inimical group that now later Christian history are identified as the enemies of the Christian faithful that need to be destroyed in in Palestine. So it's a Palestinian people, a people of this Levantine Palestinian region that need to be destroyed and defeated now by the Christians. So I'll just pause there because I think there's probably a lot and we can talk about later stages of how that becomes how the Christian community comes to imagine, or certain parts seem to develop, theologies that instead of having it be the Franks, one of the other speeches, accounts of the sermon by Robert the Monk is very national in the sense, or like it's about Latin Christendom, and they're all Franks, but it's like basically says you are the chosen people, the Franks. So you are going to go and substitute, and now you're going to enact. It's not just the spiritualized, kind of idea of the heavenly Jerusalem, but now you are actually the new chosen people, and you are going to enact kind of biblical narrative by going and, taking over Palestine. It belongs to you. You have taken over the inheritance of the actual territory and land. And then we can talk a little bit more both about the biblical, but later maybe how the Franks, the Christians, start thinking, well, maybe the Jews will be the ones who actually have to go back as part of these end times in an ingathering. And it shifts. So from Catholicism, from medieval church kind of approaches in the High Middle Ages, in the era of the Crusades, we have one new interpretation of kind of interpreting biblical text and salvation history as part of this project of genocidal war against the peoples of this, eastern land of Palestine. And in Protestants, principally, especially Puritans and then Americans, because that's where so much of American Christianity comes out, from these dissident Protestants who came as their own settler colonists, they invent a kind of different approach of reading this kind of salvation history.
Appreciate all of that breakdown, Adnan. A couple of things on it. First of all, I want to just give a shout out to Darren too, who had sent some notes, and Darren and I may do a subsequent conversation too, where we delve even a little bit more into the scripture.
Deuteronomy 25,
yeah,
17, 19. Yeah.
But the one of the I think one of the other interesting parts of this story around the Amalekites too is like that there's this, and I think it's in the book of Samuel, which is later, a little bit later, but
chapter 15. Yes.
Yeah, there's this whole thing about a punishment that comes from God, right? Basically because the genocide isn't severe enough.
That's
essentially.
Yeah.
And so like the instructions were like kill the men, the women, the children, and their I'm gonna get it wrong, but it's like their livestock, like all of the food that they have access to. And they, if I remember it correctly, and you can correct me or Darren can in the chat, they do kill all the men, women, and children, but they preserve some of the livestock,
the best livestock that
people
wanted as spoils of war, right?
Right.
So they're materialist versus your, kind of religious ideological conflict, right? They didn't do what Samuel said, which was you have to obliterate all even their livestock and blot out their memory completely, erase them. And Saul, allows his men and maybe himself to take some of the nicest cows and best looking sheep as spoils of war after murdering and slaughtering every single man, woman, and child of the Amalekites. And when confronted by Samuel, who says, you didn't do, God is angry. God was angry with me last night that I helped make you king. You were chosen as king, but you didn't listen to the dictate of God. And Saul's excuse, well, we were just bringing them back to like make them as nice offerings for the temple. And, you don't know if like Samuel really believes that. But the point is, as he says, obedience is more important than giving a sacrifice. God's word came. He said, commit genocide, eliminate every single one of them. And you didn't follow that to the very letter. And so as a result, you're no longer going to be the king. Your legitimacy is gone. You were made king by God. God doesn't want you to be king. Your days are finished. And in fact, the story continues, and it is really about David becoming the real king, because Saul wasn't pious enough, even though he was repentant after this and said, please, let me be forgiven. But he didn't genocide on the order completely, on the order, of God, right? So he was supposed to absolutely wipe out every living thing of the Amalekites. And he spared a few that thought, as spoils of war, and that wasn't good enough.
Yeah, and so I think one, obviously a story like this raises all sorts of, issues of, all these stories are, they can be interpreted and, taught and whatever, a variety of ways. I mean, I find it very interesting. Like the Christian church that I grew up in was very much it's I don't mind saying is a UCC church, and they have like the God is still speaking thing. It's fairly progressive, right? They don't talk a lot about the Old Testament at all
You're right.
because it's just very difficult to kind of square with a lot of the faith principles that they're trying to instill into people that are raised within the church. And but I think that, a lot of churches do talk about these histories, and talk about them in quite kind of, yeah, that importance of obedience. I mean, you could say, right, the lesson is just obedience, right, on
Yeah.
one level, and, and the importance of obedience to God. And so that is your lesson. But I think that then it brings into question, of course, like you know, who are the people who are directing you, and what are they directing you to do, and what stories do they draw upon? And so, like, again, you reference the Crusades, right? And drawing upon this same story, this same history, using it as, one of the biblical divine sort of justifications of what, the Christians who were going to participate in the Crusades were supposed to remember, the lessons they were supposed to remember as they went into the same region. And I think that, obviously I mean, I think most of us, at least, it has been talked about, but after October 7th, you
Yeah.
did have this. I mean, even Netanyahu was
He
referencing
said it.
this.
He
Yeah,
said,
he
"This is
said it
Amalek."
directly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His
Yeah.
first speech really to the Israeli public was basically recalling these biblical motifs from Samuel, Deuteronomy, and also, the Exodus one, where that was sort of justified in a way as the judgment of God because the Israelites had been attacked.
Right.
They were, in the wilderness. So the idea that we are victims, which authorizes now any level of retaliatory violence is now justified. It's allowed, and so that's also a very important component of the use of it in the October 7th context, is that when Netanyahu says they are Amalek and ushers a genocidal call forth, it's justified by characterizing that we're the real victims. So whatever we're doing now afterwards is totally justified. It has got precedent. It's got this kind of sense of the divine, mandate that when this has happened to you, now you should just absolutely eradicate these people, and anything you do is totally sanctioned, by God. And that's also what we saw in the Crusader violence. Like, we don't actually have a lot of cases before. Well, I don't know. I wouldn't want to say that, like, this kind of biblical language wasn't deployed to characterize one's enemies without doing a much more thorough, examination, especially during the era perhaps of Constantine and the early Christian Roman Empire, because they may have wanted to, adopt elements from what they saw in the so-called Old Testament or Hebrew Bible that valorize kings. And, there's a lot of motifs of this around Charlemagne, when he is made Holy Roman Emperor and so on, that the Old Testament is, kind of popular for the ideology around political authority, Christ as a king, and I'm just a kind of reflection of the glory and legitimacy of Christ. So maybe they did sometimes use it. I would have to check that, but I don't think it was very common, within, say, Latin Christian society to just characterize any enemy as Amalek. But the fact that Pope Urban II is attributed with using it to announce this kind of war, it wasn't just typology, because in fact, actually, they didn't know much about the Muslims, and they planned to go. They didn't talk about converting them and bringing them, not in the early phases or stages. It really was this kind of genocidal eradication. And it was also, again, a victim sort of mentality. Like, the whole earlier part of the speech is recounting that, lurid tales of like rather preposterous, accounts, as if this was sort of the routine case of the humiliation and victimization of Eastern Christians, like lurid tales of like, uh, forced circumcision and then using the blood of the circumcision to defile holy altars, and, just this kind of like very emotive blood kind of piety and injury, in the sense that we have to defend them. We're part of the same community and body of Christ. And so it's an injury to them, it's an injury to us. And this is where I think a lot of this kind of responsibility to protect kind of doctrine comes from, is that we have to intervene. But they authorized doing so in this biblical language of identifying the Saracen as Amalek. And so it's not even the first time that the Muslims, the Saracens, have been identified, as Amalek, as part of a then, kind of genocidal assault. And we see what happened with the Crusades is that a new kind of war, a kind of holy war that was being developed and wasn't part of Christian. I mean, this is really a reversal of a lot of, in the past, like even the people who came over with William the Conqueror to, conquer England in 1066, they like had to do all this penance afterwards, because even though they'd gotten sanction for it and so on, shedding blood, especially of other Christians, was, sinful, but really killing it all was pretty sinful. And so you were supposed to seek penitence. This is in fact actually reversed and turned into the opposite way, as something approved and in fact spiritually, kind of like, energizing and escalating and elevating, to do so. And as a result, it led to pretty barbaric stuff where, they wiped out whole cities, in Madra, and then, cannibalized, according to some reports. Or what happened in Jerusalem itself upon the kind of victory and conquest is the massacre of everybody basically that they could get a hold of in the city. And that included Jews, included Muslims. I mean, there's reports about, burning the Jews in the synagogue alive. And of course, as we talked about before, in Europe, before going on crusade, many of the, kind of popular forces, associated the Jews with the Muslims. And said, if we're going to go kill these enemies of Christ, we've got some here. And so you had this kind of like warrant. So the first really big pogroms, were, around this time of Jews in Europe. And there's a kind of association with this genocidal violence that has roots in how the Christians saw their place in salvation history. And this kind of crusading orientation and mentality sort of develops. And that's just one of the ironies that, of course, you have Netanyahu sounding like Pope Urban II. And that is symbolic, I would say, of a larger way in which Zionism is, in some sense, not only a product of 19th century romantic nationalism and the idea that a people, a nation deserve to and must have, in fact, a kind of their own nation state as the appropriate form for the political expression of a nation, however it's being defined. It's always being defined as like an ancient people. And so Zionism could fit into that, that Jews had existed and been a people and had a kind of classical ancient history and period, and that needed to be reconstituted. So it fit into this kind of, secular romantic nationalism of Europe in the 19th century as an ideology. But I would argue that it also is an outgrowth, in some sense, of Christian theology and Christian ideas about salvation history and about the relationship to the others that comes, and really a beginning point, you could say, is this kind of departure of the Crusades. But what needs to be explained is, well, how did Christian Zionism develop? Because it really precedes the actual development of the political project of a kind of political settler colonial Zionism in the middle to late 19th centuries. That already are many Protestant thinkers who have kind of reversed the Catholic approach and reversed And they were very critical. Many of them were very critical of the Crusades. They were critical of pilgrimage, which was one of the kind of penitential bases for kind of the work of crusading in the spiritual economy, of the remission of sins. And these things started to become exploited by the institutional church and sold, that you didn't actually have to go on crusade if you donated money to the church for a crusade and essentially paid for somebody to go. And so they started selling these indulgences. And this is part of what leads to the Protestant Reformation, is discontent with Catholic theology and practice and the institution of the church, one of which was, its support for the crusade and constant, unceasing preaching of the crusade and raising money, and essentially selling remission of sins to raise money, often which didn't go into any crusading. And certainly after 1291, the end of the Crusader states, in the fall of Acre in 1291, you have attempts and projects to re-establish a crusade or to fight the Ottomans in the 15th and 16th centuries, after they have conquered Constantinople and become kind of the major geopolitical power of the Eastern Mediterranean, certainly in Eastern and Central Europe, and are a worry for Christendom. So they were, maybe calls to unite and form a crusade against the Turk and so on. But there was disenchantment with this movement and the way it had been exploited by the institutional church. And so there's some kind of critique going on in the Protestant Reformation that includes also how salvation history works and what kind of apocalyptic sensibility, because that's the important thing that I didn't mention here, is that there's a whole tradition of looking at the Crusades as not just having that geopolitical purpose, not just making these claims for the Holy Land, but also fitting into millenarian kinds of expectations that if we reconstituted ourselves and restored the Holy Land to governance of Christ, that the second coming would take place. And this would be a fulfillment of history. And that's even a tradition within the Catholic crusading, kind of orientation, that there were apocalyptic and millenarian expectations. Many of the people who are adherents of that seem to have been the ones most involved with massacring Jews and so forth. And so there's some interplay, so that when the Protestant Reformation changes some of these things, some of these structures still go forward, but maybe the roles of particular groupings within it changes. And in this era of disenchantment with the actual Crusades, I think what happens is there's a substitution in that end time scenario that Augustine, even had acknowledged, that at some point we will have the conversion of all the Jews, we will have the second coming, we will then have this millennial age of grace, the age of the Spirit. And there were apocalyptic thinkers even at the end of the medieval period, like Joachim of Fiore, Gerard of Borgo San Donino. These people, some of them were condemned and seen as a little bit heretical because of their apocalyptic ideas. They took them too far or applied them in ways that were radical against some of the conventions of institutional Catholic Church thinking and theology at the time. But they were kind of glimpses that these ideas could be changed according to circumstance. You could interpret scripture in new ways, like Joachim of Fiore did, which is that there are stages or dispensations and eras in history that could be studied by interpreting the Bible properly and then applied to understand what's happening and will happen in the future in your own world as part of salvation history. And so this kind of apocalyptic thinking is essentially a scripturally based form of the history of the future. Like, it's history, i.e., it's already set down, but we are watching and trying to interpret and figure out and decode and do our analysis, much in the same way. I think some Marxists are very millenarian, and they're sort of like, oh, look at these contradiction of forces going to lead to the inevitable fall of capitalism now. It's happening now, And of course, all apocalyptic and millenarian thinkers worth their salt, are basically ones who can say, we are at the cusp of the change. Like, only somebody like Augustine, who is like very tied into this kind of imperial, like, we're just going to create Christian society and, postpone a lot of these other thorny kind of questions of the book of the apocalypse and so on. everybody else who gets interested in the apocalypse is always because they think maybe it's imminent, And so these thinkers were thinking, oh, this is about to happen. And so were the Crusaders. Many of the Crusaders were thinking it's about to happen. And, I think this is the kind of avenue through which Protestant apocalyptic sort of thinkers start to get the idea it's not going to be a crusade. It's not us, as they start reinterpreting some of this salvation history and apocalyptic kind of expectations. And they find lots of things in the scripture that they can use, like Deuteronomy 1:5. They basically start to literalize, again, the historical component of the Old Testament and say, yeah, these are prophecies that are actually for the Jews. And so when Moses says in Deuteronomy, I'm forgetting the exact chapter. Deuteronomy 25. No, actually, it was in. Okay, well, I'll look it up, and put it in the notes. But it was basically saying, a promise to the Israelites that although they've been dispersed, and I think he is sort of saying really it was about the previous sort of era, like they were enslaved in Egypt and all that they will be given, they will be reconstituted. And so this then becomes like Protestants start applying it to Jews and a doctrine of the ingathering of Jews as having to take place before the kind of rapture, before not the rapture, that's the later doctrine, but before the fulfillment of the second coming. And so this is my point about millenarian thinking. Sometimes it can be to displace, that's all way in the future, and it's politically quietistic. It's like, well, we'll just wait for the Messiah to come, right? And he's not about to come now. However, when material conditions, social conditions, political conditions, and the cultural resources work together, and a community that has these kind of expectations about a Messiah or second coming of Christ and all of that, they revive those and try and apply them to the world that they're engaged in. And then sometimes it can be not just a consolation, oh, we're going to be saved, like, say, Jews and Muslims in Iberia. Many of them sort of thought, well, the Ottomans will come. And some said, there was even a Romaniote Jewish scholar, a rabbi, this is the Cretans, or Greek-speaking Jews of like the Greek-speaking world. He was on the island of Crete, Eliyahu Kapsali, in the early 16th century, facing kind of the Latins coming. Everybody was like, oh my God, these Latins are terrible. They're constantly like killing, slaughtering, enslaving. Looked to the Ottoman Empire as a possible messianic kind of figure, right? So, maybe we'll be saved by the Ottoman emperor. He'll come, and we could think of him as like a typology of an expected messianic kind of figure. Or it can be, we have to do something about it now ourselves to prepare the conditions so that Christ will come back. And that's a strand of Protestant thinking that starts to emerge in the 16th century, and really in the 17th century, is people saying, we should encourage the Jews to go back, because that will then be the trigger, the historical trigger for these end times to happen, which will lead to the conversion of the Jews and the universal conquest, the defeat of Antichrist, and the establishment of, a universalist Christian utopia. I mean, this is essentially the imperial universalist sort of vision that's projected in these apocalyptic and eschatological prophecies and predictions. But what it shows you is that these traditions, they kind of adapt a lot to the times, and they get little alterations, or they're interpreted in a slightly different way. The actors can change in different, kind of positions. For some people, the Pope is like evil and is like an Antichrist. And for others, there's going to be an angelic pastor who's going to come. Sometimes the Ottoman emperor, and this is a teacher of mine, the dear departed Cornell Fleischer, taught at the University of Chicago. And he wrote a wonderful article called Sultan as Messiah. And he looked at like how there were all these like, Venetian prophecies that like the Messiah, the Sultan, is going to come and he's going to conquer all of Europe. And that's not a bad thing. He'll be the last world emperor. And in fact, actually, he'll get rid of the evil, corrupt popes, and the angelic pastor will then come, and there will be a condominium of, a true holy pope and an emperor united together in a universal Christendom. I mean, these are these imperialist kind of imaginations, and Protestants had their own versions of them in which they looked to the ingathering as something that should happen. If it was happening, it was a good thing, and perhaps it should be encouraged to happen and supported to happen so that end times would be created. And of course, the most influential ones are, for us thinking about this today, are the ones that the Puritans, and in the 19th century, and we could probably talk a little bit about Darby, who is this kind of dispensationalist kind of Christian Zionist thinker, who really very explicitly, kind of argues that, this is how that, there will be this ingathering, and that there will be the rapture, and that this is the whole goal, is to like make this kind of thing sort of happen. So the roots of this, and he was operating in the United States, the 1830s, 1840s, and that's similar to British and English and Scottish kind of radical, kind of dispensationalist types of thinkers, or thinkers who were picking up on that 17th and 18th century milieu of early Christian Zionist kind of speculative theology about this happening, became much more concrete about it, as we should kind of support this. We should encourage the foreign policy of the British Empire to achieve this. And so it's clear that from there, it was a short step to, some kind of condominium of interests with emerging responses to anti-Semitism that was, terrible and rife, and a solution to anti-Semitism. One solution was, the development of this ethno-nationalist ideology, and it had sources that, came from, of course, nationalist, romantic nationalism of the 19th century, but the ground, in many ways, I would argue, had already been prepared, that the idea that we should have these people sent and go colonize, the only problem is that the Ottoman Empire is in the way. So when we talk about, the sick man of Europe and the Eastern question, part of these calculations were what would create the conditions for this Christian ambition of repatriating the Jews, whether they want to or not. I mean, they encouraged those who wanted to support them, but the idea was they should be, sent there. And it wasn't for the benefit necessarily always of the Jews. There were some philo-Semites, who kind of actually, romanticized, the idea that the Jews could be this, kind of wonderful, talented Western nation that would then be a light to and usher in all of these sorts of things. I mean, there was some of the language really upset, like, James, King of England, that these people were so keen on, establishing Israel that would then be a dominant, kind of nation, basically, of the world. They would convert to Christianity, of course, but they would be this dominant nation, a light unto the world. And so you can see that the Christian components and the Zionist components, really converge in the late 19th century into fulfilling what had been actually a kind of Christian ambition of settler colonial repatriation, as they saw it, repatriation. I mean, that's its own kind of problem. But yeah, those are some of the kind of connections, I think.
That's great. Thank you. I mean, before we go on, I should just a couple things. So thank you, ZZ Lion Dad, for the donation, and also just this is the actual line within Samuel. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So that was that's the actual biblical text there that we were referring to earlier. The other thing, I mean, so you said a whole lot there, and I know we're gonna come back a little bit. No. It's great. It's great because it's so much. I mean, this is the thing, is we're trying to kind of summarize and provide these different threads throughout hundreds of years of history, really, and I mean, even thousands if we're talking about going back to the kind of biblical context, and even, I mean, even to the Crusades, going back at least about 1,000 now. Um, that there's just so many kind of threads to cover, and I do at some point kind of want to come back to the United States because I do think that's a really interesting kind of part of this that is really not like we don't, you know, I mean, one, like Nick Estes had a really good discussion recently of
Manifest Destiny.
Manifest Destiny that people should go listen to, but just understanding, of course, this, which I mean, we talk about it, but it's really important, I think, to really sit deeply with some of these things in terms of that this idea of a greater Israel or an Eretz Israel and this kind of constantly expansionist ideology based in a kind of religious zealotry as well as geopolitical kind of interests and so on, um, can create. And in the United States, of course, it says, hey, we're going to take over this whole continent, basically. And
Mm.
you think about the Monroe Doctrine, it's like, really, we're going to dominate this entire hemisphere, right? Is the kind of course, now we would say US-led imperialism is a global thing, but that the importance of kind of hemispheric control within the United States' own imagination. And I want to put that aside for a minute, but I do want to come back to that because I think even one of the interesting groups in this, you mentioned one of the thinkers from the Puritans, but also there's the Pilgrims are their own kind of connection into Christian Zionism as well. And so there's just a lot of interesting connections here. I mean, it, but coming back to the United States in a little bit, I mean, I think where you've led us up to in this discussion is to talk a little bit more about the connection then of that early phase of what we now think of as Zionism, of the movement, Theodore Herzl, these figures, right? And the different interests, of course, that they connect into within Europe, some of which are explicitly racist and just are looking for a resolution to the Jewish question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
In a kind of expulsion. But some of which are colonial, as you've pointed out, are based in this idea of, and some of which are religious as well, in these notions of, um, you know, we weren't able to establish the crusading states,
Mhm.
or we weren't able to maintain them. And, maybe this can be our resolution of that, kind of that need, which is based both geopolitically, but also is based in a kind of religious ideology as well. But I guess what I wanted to do was kind of talk a little bit about the threads within Christian Zionist ideology that you see that influence Zionism, and maybe some of the parallels between the two at a kind of level of ideas and you know religious scripture and so on, if you could.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting issue, and I have a couple of thoughts on it. But I'd be interested also what you might have seen as kind of connections now that we've been exploring the Christian Zionism and we've been thinking, over the last however long of analyzing, forms of settler colonial Zionism, political Zionism, strains of, you know, revisionist Zionism of the, kind of sort of fascistic extreme. There's like varieties, but it seems to me that there's something in the crusading idea that you actually have to kind of make the conditions for the second coming, in the apocalyptic imagination of those, and that it is rooted very specifically in considering the biblical land as more real than the actual land and territory. And there's been a lot of, interesting kind of scholarship on even American Christian Zionists from the 19th century or early 20th century who were so inspired to go to Palestine, and visit the, holy land and the holy places, and how jarring it was for them to see an Arab and mixed, many Armenians and Arabs, and during this time under the Ottomans, Jews, and many different kind of people in this territory, and particularly in the city, and it not conforming with the image that they have, which is of a pure biblical kind of space. And so I think that's one other kind of interesting component of it, because initially Zionism was not necessarily as a ethno-national political movement, was just the idea that the Jews needed a nation, to be a real people, to re-enter history. So there is a kind of sense of taking over Christian time, but even if it's been secularized, of this kind of like overcoming the sense that you can't really be a people in history unless you have a nation and a kind of political expression of that in a nation state. And so this is distilling into this kind of ethno-nationalist movement. But it could have been in a lot of places, because it was first and foremost an attempt at, being a settler colonial movement, finding a place where they could make sure that they dominated and evacuated an indigenous population to establish their own idea of an exclusive Jewish supremacist state, where being Jewish was what granted you citizenship as a ethno-nationalist ideology. So of course there were like resources of imagery and metaphor, and there was liturgical kind of components of the longing for Jerusalem and the idea of the return. I mean, that is of course in kind of that section in Deuteronomy, where Moses makes this promise to his people, that you will have, and it's a greater Israel. Okay, like it is from the Nile to the Euphrates. So when we see those projections of those maps and things, and when we hear Netanyahu so recently acknowledging that he is really taken with the vision of a greater Israel, so hello, Saudi, Jordan, Egypt, like don't have any illusions. You cannot expect that this is like trying to materialize kind of biblical, and this is part of nationalism too, is this kind of idea that we were a people who had an ancient kingdom, and what makes us legitimate now is reconstituting in some way. It's even a very secular kind of sort of notion or idea, but taking from the Christian Zionists the specificity of this has to happen in the biblical context, because it's fulfilling Christian expectations about the end of salvation, of the goals of salvation history, and the fulfillment of eschatological vision and the second coming of Christ. So there is a kind of famous story. I forget who it was. I don't know if it was Shaftesbury, but because the Zionist leadership, basically, in a few hundred years had gone from like hoping the Ottoman Sultan would give them, well, even like just a few decades, was thinking that the Ottomans might give them, kind of territory in the Levant when it was ruled by the Ottomans, to quickly recognizing that, the Eastern question was a question about how we were going to divide up, the Ottoman Empire and subject it to colonialism. And one of the things that kept it from happening maybe earlier, when the scramble for Africa was happening, or later in the early part of the 20th century, was partly rivalries and divisions among competing nation state colonizers, whether it's France, Russia, Tsarist Russia before the revolution, or the British, about like, how would this happen? How would this be divided up? Because the French, of course, had their own ancient kind of claims that come back from the era of the Crusades. They characterized it as a French, because the language in, say, Robert the Monk, who I mentioned, has a version of the speech of Urban II, was directed to you, oh, you gains of Francorum, oh, you nation of the Franks, the people, the Frankish people. So they thought of these crusader states that had been established as essentially a Frankish or, expression, really, in a way, of a special and unique relationship that France had to the Levant. And so they were desperate, of course, to also have, part of this kind of territory. Allenby, when he, came under the British mandate and crossed in from Transjordan with his, army, really said this is a momentous moment when he came into Palestine, that not since the days of Saladin have, Christian, rulers been here. So they were the ones who were very invested in the kind of importance of this. And so Jewish Zionists who were looking for a territory recognized, okay, given this kind of potential dividing up of the Ottoman Empire, we should kind of appeal to the chief colonial and imperial powers to be our sponsors. And that's what they did. And, so they lobbied with the British to get the Balfour Declaration, etc. But I believe it was like Shaftesbury, because he was looking at like Argentina or, Uganda and places like this. And I think it was Lord Shaftesbury. It was, anyway, a very dedicated Christian Zionist who made a special appeal about all of the biblical passages and all of the biblical sites, and said this is where the Jewish people belong. So it was in some ways the Christian Zionist kind of investment in it that was very decisive, for formulating the way in which Zionism then materialized what had been a liturgical and kind of spiritual kind of expression of longing in the era of the exile into a political project with a defined, territorial base that was biblical, and the biblical justification for it actually being meaningful, not just as like an appeal to, a familiar story and language for Jews, but as, the actual kind of plan and program and justification as a fulfillment, like any good nationalism should have, of some kind of ancient history that it can call upon. And so I think those are kind of real components of it. And of course, in our previous discussion, I had said that I think of the Crusades as really being the first Western kind of project of settler colonialism in history, i.e. not one sponsored by just a particular nation state. And I think that's the case, that even though they had imperial patronage of the British Empire in particular, that this was a project of the West, right? To reestablish, as it were, like I keep saying because that's their language, but to establish, a homeland for the Jews as a nation state, potentially in Palestine as a colonial project, is a project of the West in just the way that the Crusader states were. And we've seen that it is supported by the entire West because they are invested through this long history, whether you think of it as Protestant Christian Zionism or just the affiliations and the habits and practices that were developed out of crusading as a impetus for settler colonialism, for racism, for enslavement, for genocidal kind of subjugation of others, that this just makes sense as a kind of history and as a project to which the West is committed. And that's something that we see Zionism recognizing as a way to reinforce its legitimacy and claim upon support from the West, that it is, and this is something that was thought about, from Crusader times into like the Protestant sort of period as well, is we've got a problem with the Islamic world. We've got this power that's there. How are we going to break it? So that we can dominate Asia, West Asia, this region that we have investment in, but also the geopolitical, value of access into the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea for trade routes. This has been, why did they end up going in in the 15th century or circumnavigating? It's because they were kept out after they lost their entrepot of the Crusader states, which had always had the goal of expanding. Like the, Zionist entity, it had no declared borders. I mean, the very first kind of, communication back by the leaders who conquered Jerusalem in the First Crusade was a letter, back to the Pope saying, we have, taken Jerusalem and we intend to expand from sea to sea, like this borderless kind of Christian universalist kind of imagination. So they always had this problem that they were opposed then during the era of the Crusades. Later in the in the early modern period, they had to circumnavigate, and go around because they couldn't get through West Asia to, to support the colonies and colonization that then they established. The British were very interested, of course, in the Suez Canal and the link. That's why they established these petty principalities in the Gulf region. It's all part of, a kind of geopolitical and strategic interest in the region in certain strategic points. That the Zionists could appeal to. And they could appeal to not only by being a kind of new, loyal Western state, the only way that it was going to be possible for Jews to be full citizens and Westerners was to go be a settler colonial community and be a bulwark against the Islamic world on behalf of Western empires. And that's the role that they intended, and that's the role that was envisioned, and that's the role that gives them legitimacy now, is constantly being said, hey, we are the frontier state, the bulwark against Islamic barbarism, and so forth. So what we've seen is that the Jews went from being allies of the Muslims in the era that I study into, now being the kind of quintessential kind of representation of Westernness by being a settler colonial, kind of state in West Asia, as the kind of front, the spearhead, tip of the spear against kind of Islamic, culture, and this dangerous kind of world of the Islamic world.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you brought into my mind again, and I know we talked about this last time, was the advent of the term Judeo-Christian civilization, which I think you said comes in 48 or something. It comes like
Well, it was
right
definitely
in.
after the post-World War period. I think we really start seeing it in the 1950s,
Mhm.
yeah, as like a very common way of characterizing Western culture and civilization as Judeo-Christian, which is like amazing that after the Holocaust, we're going to say, oh, well, it's actually a Judeo-Christian. We just tried to genocide and eliminate the Jews and solve the Jewish question this way. And we've had a millennia, 2 millennia of persecution and oppression that ramped up, really transformed into violent eliminationist and subordination and subjugation in the era of the Crusades. As I said, the first big pogroms are associated with that, to suddenly now kind of try and characterize it as Judeo-Christian, when in fact, actually, for most of that period, they were seen as under Orientalism and colonial racist ideology, and of course, with its roots in hostility from Christian, anti-Jewish polemics, the adversus Judaeos tradition, to see them as a rootless, kind of, Eastern foreign body, that could undermine variously the health and purity of Christian society. That's the medieval Latin Christendom kind of, story, to undermining racial purity, to undermining kind of national identity because they didn't share, the same formulation of national identity. And so that's what Zionism is one response in light of the era of colonialism and ethno-nationalist ideology, and racism, anti-Semitic racism, to create a solution, of becoming Westerners by joining in the settler colonial enterprise, by being engaged in, a kind of genocidal process. And, as I've said sometimes in the past, like, how do you become part of Europe? Like, Spain had like a real problematic and troubled kind of situation. It was, all these Moors, and Jews, and, was always seen as very different. And really in 1492 and subsequently over the course of the 16th century, it becomes a European, kind of Christian power by eliminating religious difference, by suppressing and characterizing as heretical those they forcibly converted, and ultimately developing a kind of racial purity law kind of approach themselves with the limpieza de sangre, and ejecting even the Muslim descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity. They had to be expelled. And that's how I'm arguing, in a way, because of the crusading precedent, that's how you become part of Europe. And so this is how they solved that component of anti-Semitism and the Jewish question. Is you have to leave Europe to become European. You have to become a settler colonizer. You have to become, somebody who genocides the indigenous, displaces them, or subordinates them, subjects them, in order to become a fully kind of Europeanized, Western, acceptable, citizen through your nation, in Western civilization and culture.
Appreciate it. How are you on time? I know you had mentioned about 90 minutes. Do you have
Yeah, I'm
a hard
okay for a
stop?
bit more. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, if you think I have, I mean, I've been,
No, 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 no.
I
I'm good for
apologize.
more. I'm just checking in with you, Adnan. Just let me know. Like, you can private chat me or whatever if we get to
Okay,
that point.
sure.
But appreciated yeah, all
We
of
hadn't
this that
come
you're
to the
laying out.
US, and you would have also some thoughts on that. So
What's that?
I said, because we hadn't come that much to the US and the
Yeah,
more
yeah, yeah.
contemporary, and you would also have a lot of thoughts on that, I think.
Well, maybe. I mean, I have thoughts, but whether I'm capable of really laying them out, I don't know. But one thing, there's like 300 plus people watching this stream, also on all different platforms. Just, yeah, if you're on one of the YouTube channels, make sure to like, subscribe, share it. Also, if you're on Twitter. And both Adnan and I have Patreons for our shows, so check out and support those. And appreciate all the folks engaging in the chat and everything. It's great. Um, so yeah, let's talk about the U.S. I think, I guess one of the interesting things is just that, the US has a very deep fabric, really, of Christian Zionism. Like, I think a lot of that just has to do with the timing of things, and the fact that, especially, you gave a lot of the roots within also Catholicism here, but once you get some of the Protestant groups, like, a lot of them take on different strands of this. Um, and the Pilgrims are one. We talked a little bit about Puritans, and of course, as I mentioned before, there is a U.S. version of a Christian settler colonial mandate, which, again, just to what you said, it never really recognized its borders or its boundaries. I mean, this is in some ways one of the contradictions between the British Empire and the early colonies, right? Is that the colonies are like, we don't care if, going west causes issues with the French or with the indigenous people or anything else. And they wanted that power, and they had an endless sight of just settling the continent, buying up whatever land they could from groups that they didn't want to go to war with necessarily, um and just going from ocean to ocean in a similar fashion as what you kind of laid out with how they potentially saw the Crusader states as well. And it's just interesting. We have, from an early stage, like, people who become prominent, you know, ideological figures, ministers, etc., that have this kind of eschatological visions, connections to Christian Zionism as well. Um, and one of the things that you and I had talked about a little bit is just thinking about this notion of how these kind of ideas shape the ideological matrix of countries, right? And so we talked about that a lot. Well, we haven't talked about it as much probably as we should within Israel, but
Mm.
also within the United States. And so, And especially, within the conservative movement in the United States too, in the last 50 years, it is kind of refashioned itself from kind of the William F. Buckley, era to today. Um, so what do you think is important about considering or thinking about Christian Zionism and its history and its present within the United States?
Yeah, really important, especially given what we're facing and witnessing now, is that there is a commitment to support of Israel in its genocide, no matter what, by certain constituencies, and that is particularly not just, of course, uh, Zionist supporting communities, you know, in the U.S. and across Europe, but a particular apocalyptically dedicated community of Christian Zionists, particularly Christian evangelicals who have interpreted, even Trump is somehow fitting into these kind of biblical, he's the new Cyrus, who restores the Jews after the temple destruction. And, they were very excited by his role in moving the embassy to US embassy to Jerusalem, restoring the, not restoring, what am I saying, but like acknowledging and recognizing the illegal annexation of the Golan Heights, you know. So they saw in him a kind of almost a figure fulfilling their political, religio-political, political theological kind of vision. And so there is a massive hardcore constituency for unquestioned U.S. support for Israel, with Kufi, Christians United for Israel, and John Hagee, and people like this. So the way in which they have become moved from just a very kind of theological orientation and commitment, though in earlier phases there were actual projects for, supporting settlement and so on. But a lot of evangelicals were kind of hostile to getting involved in politics, and really, like so many Americans, knew nothing about U.S. empire abroad or U.S. foreign policy, did not have it as a huge priority, except when the U.S. may have been involved in any of its major wars and sustained casualties that people would then notice, So in some sense, they've been activated, and the process by which they've been activated to care about Israel and to support it is at least as important as anything else we would say about the Jewish, kind of the Zionist lobby using Jewish pro-Zionist, pro-Israel organizations in the U.S. like AIPAC and so on. We often focus on those, but in fact, there is a much more interesting holy alliance that has emerged that I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I have two students who are writing MA papers and things about Christian Zionism and U.S. foreign policy. And so I've benefited a lot from, there's a vast literature on Christian Zionism, it's massive. And then especially about their relations with, their kind of more contemporary relations with Israel, starting, with Billy Graham's visit in like the early 70s and sort of forward. That's become a really big focus of attention in American religious studies, to try and explain how this phenomenon of evangelicals who held themselves out of politics, what are the factors, some on culture, issues, abortion, etc. Like something happened in that era to activate them into politics. And one of the things really was clearly interpreting Christian Zionism in a direct way to see the United States as somehow a special mission and a special destiny to fulfill and enable and create these scenarios of end times in a kind of, as a kind of Christian imperial force. And that is really, to my mind, where this has turned into an extremely dangerous, aggressive adjunct. Because we know, of course, like Christianization and colonialism always went together, but what is happening now, and we know that, since the, kind of Portuguese and the Spanish and, the British missionaries, throughout their, kind of colonial empire and so on. So there's always been a kind of component in which missionizing was in service of colonizing, and the two went hand in hand together. But what we're seeing now is, it directing kind of foreign policy in an apocalyptic sort of way, where some people would claim that it isn't in the United States interests, like some people say, oh, rational interest calculation would say this is a distortion. And of course, these people typically have blamed, the so-called, Zionist Jewish lobby exclusively, without paying as much attention to the fact that there is a massive and more numerous, Christian kind of evangelical Zionist population that has electoral, once they've become activated, and this is a voting issue for them, have become, very important and salient in the political calculations of our, government. But what's, I think, kind of interesting is that these are paired very closely. There's some kind of symmetry, going in this radical, apocalyptic, fascistic imagination that is mirrored between Christian evangelical Zionists and, this new kind of form of religious kind of extremist Zionism, that's different from the secular labor Zionism. And they're all genocidal and they're all colonialist, but there are different variations within them of how they respond and behave. This settler kind of, they're all, really settlers, but I mean, this, new communities that are being formed in to colonize the West Bank and in previous times Gaza, that so-called settler, kind of movement has developed a very similar kind of radical, apocalyptic, imagination that is a lot like what Christian Zionists have been promoting. And I don't think it was very common, even in, if you look in the early, 50s and 60s, there, most of the people who were religious Jews or were religious and Orthodox in Israel were often kind of anti-Zionist in a certain way, or thought that this was a kind of disfiguring of Jewish expectation of the Messiah. That's supposed to be a divine plan, but here these secularists and now increasingly religious extremists have kind of tried to anticipate, his salvation history and these prophecies by making it happen themselves, which is, in a way sort of blasphemous or irreligious. But now that is not necessarily the dominant, there's been a political activization of parts of the Jewish, Orthodox community by these radical apocalyptic and messianic kinds of figures who want to create greater Israel right now. And they have a real alliance, even if they disagree about some components of that final apocalyptic scenario. I mean, they don't expect that they're going to be, and in fact, they resent attempts to missionize them, which I think is at least one serious strand in the past of Christian Zionist kind of interest in Israel, is that there's the ingathering, but then also you got to make them Christian for this to really, happen. And that's been more problematic, but yet on a sort of structural level, they are mutually reinforcing, and they tend towards a very similar kind of extremist genocidal politics that may go against. And each of them seem to have like a real leverage, in politically speaking, either in the Netanyahu government, where they're the balance of power, the government falls without their support. So some of their priorities are always having to be taken into account to achieve and fulfill and materialize this greater Israel vision. And likewise, the Christian evangelicals, are so, although it's so interesting to see, and I wonder what you think about, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who in some ways harkens back to a much older form of anti-Semitism that, like, hey, we may be able to criticize, Israel, and we have this America First thing that's maybe reshaping how we kind of make this commitment. But, you know, I can't be prevented from saying Jews were killers of Christ. That's just a fact. That's just our Christian belief. Don't prevent me. So I'm going to vote against the adoption of the IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism for different reasons than you or I would like oppose it, but because they want to still be able to make, kind of the Christian polemical kind of case and argument against the legitimacy of Judaism because of Christian supersession. But there is kind of maybe some fractures that are interesting that are happening here. I don't know quite how to think of this from the more religious and theological, perspective, but there are components within this community that have been so marshaled into this particular vision of the history of the future that I sometimes wonder if, as Israel now is like having real difficulties with manpower and having to enroll people my age into a new brigade, 50 to 55, of grandpas to like do border control, and are now also actively trying to recruit in diasporic Jewish communities to create a new kind of international brigade, to reinforce for this new plan that has recently been at least partially authorized by now the Israeli occupation forces have authorized this plan of, kind of the Gaza city sort of elimination kind of plan. Is that where are they going to get these resources? One wonders, are we going to see more GHF type people, which is U.S. military personnel, many of them kind of Christian evangelicals who are Christian Zionists, who see the United States as the Christian nation, Christian empire, fulfilling something in destiny in history, and Israel is a big part of that, of fulfilling that. Are they going to be willing, and are they going to be interested either as volunteers or push, kind of for more, kind of U.S. support? Like if they're having trouble finding manpower, are they going to start recruiting Christian Zionists? I wonder. I mean, this is a kind of interesting kind of problem.
Yeah, well, and how many of the Christian Zionists will they need for ICE and all of the like
the U.S. can probably be stretched too. Yeah, to do
right. Right. I mean, I was noted. I don't remember if it was Alex Avina or somebody noted that he probably did, but I think it was like within the same day or within the same couple days that both the IDF, the IOF was looking at raising its age limits for participation in the Gaza Holocaust.
right.
That at the same time ICE was saying, we can have people up to 55 or something like that, 50, whatever it was, right? But both of them were raising, those limits. And yeah, I mean, it is, I look at it as a time of these kind of these fascist really projects, right? Really testing those limits and seeing, I mean, both running up against their sort of limits of what they have in terms of manpower, but also kind of testing the limits of societies of how committed are you? How many people can we convert into this side and actually bring into these armies? Yeah, and I mean, I guess what I want to do actually now is play a couple of clips because I think it will give us something to talk about a little bit, because one of the people that I pay attention to, and it is not because I see him as a friend, but because I see him as an enemy, is Tucker Carlson. But I watch what he's doing, and it's been very interesting to watch over the last few months because he is, he's not quite the same as Marjorie Taylor Greene, but he's doing something similar. And so I pulled out just a couple of his segments, like 90-second segments that we can watch real quick. And then I think we can talk about them a little bit and talk about how, our views on kind of like what's going on here exactly.
Yeah.
So, all right, I'm going to start with one from his debate with Ted Cruz.
Growing up in Sunday school, I was taught from the Bible, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And from my perspective, I want to be on the blessing side of things.
Of those who bless the government of Israel?
Those who bless Israel is what it says. It doesn't say the government of, it says the nation of Israel. So That's in the Bible. As a Christian, I believe that.
Where is that?
I can find it to you. I don't have the scripture off the tip of my. You pull out the phone and use the Google.
It's in Genesis. So you're quoting a Bible phrase. You don't have context for it and you don't know where in the Bible it is, but that's like your theology? I'm confused. What does that even mean?
Tucker.
I'm a Christian. I want to know what you're talking about.
Okay. Where does my support for Israel come from? Number one, because biblically we're commanded to support Israel. But number two,
hold on.
I'm not holding on.
Hold on. You're a senator, and now you're throwing out theology, and I am a Christian, and I am allowed to weigh in on this. We are commanded as Christians to support the government of Israel?
We are commanded to support Israel. And what
does that mean, Israel?
We're told those who bless Israel will be blessed.
But what? Hold on. Define Israel. This is important. Are you kidding? This is a majority Christian country.
Define Israel? Do you not know what Israel is? That would be the country you've asked like 49 questions about.
So that's what Genesis, that's what God is talking about.
The nation of Israel, yes.
And so is that the current borders, the current leadership? He's talking about the political entity called Israel?
He's talking about the nation of Israel. Yeah, nations exist, and he's discussing a nation. A nation was the people of Israel.
Is the nation
They're the descendants
God's
of
referring
Abraham.
to in Genesis, is that the same as the country run by Benjamin Netanyahu right now?
Yes. Growing up in...
All right, so that's the first one. I'm going to do one more, I think. And so that one, obviously, people know. This one was an interview that he did with a nun in Palestine recently.
So you first moved to the Holy Land in 1996?
Correct. Yep.
As a nun. How are Christians doing in the Holy Land?
Well, it's become a very difficult time for them there. Basically, the Christians are in the same situation as the Muslims being a Palestinian. So there's two different things. If you live in Israel, you're a citizen. And so they can live there and work, but there's sort of some petty grievances that people might have. But if you're a Christian in Palestine, which is where most of the activities of the life of Christ are, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, Jericho, Jacob's Well, that's all within Palestine. That's the predominance of the Christian population there. And they're treated with the effects of the occupation.
So
I would say a little bit more about that second interview, because I'm sure that a lot of folks didn't catch it. But, basically Tucker's concern is connected to something you mentioned, I think, earlier on, too, is he believes and says that, hey, we're a Christian nation. We support Israel. Christians should be getting special dispensation within Israel, and they're being mistreated by the Israeli government. And of course, the nun, she has her own views, but most of the people that she has lived with and worked with for many years now are Palestinian, right? And she runs a school, and most of her students are Muslim. It's a very fascinating interview in some respects, because he goes off into all of this Islamophobia stuff at different points, and she does actually try to check him on it. But it's still like their concern. I'll play one more clip, because this gets to a little bit of their concern, because it is really about AIPAC, and it is really about the connection to Christian Zionists as well. And why don't Christian Zionists care about Christians is kind of the way that it is all being framed, right? All right, so I'll play this one, because this will help with that, bridge that gap a little bit.
I mean, we should have a Christian AIPAC group. Of course, going on.
Like, you're not allowed to shoot up the Church of the Nativity. Sorry. No. I mean, even if you're agnostic on the politics of it or whatever, which is fine, maybe preferable, but you can't do that to Christians. How about no?
I agree 100%.
Where's Ted Cruz in all this? Ted Cruz talks about how he's a Christian. Mike Johnson, as the Speaker of the House, talks about how he's a Christian. Well, they talk about it a lot.
We have to battle AIPAC and the Christian Zionists by the Christians standing up, say, not in my name. We can't be doing this. So if they're getting money from these organizations, then Christians have to have enough concern to say, I don't want this happening in my name.
No, and to my brothers in Christ.
Right. We're supposedly a country based on a Judeo-Christian heritage, right? So where is that Judeo-Christian heritage when you're destroying the very foundations of it? St. Jerome translated the Bible in Bethlehem. The cells where he was at are under the Church of the Nativity. The very roots of our Christian heritage are there, and we're letting it be destroyed.
What would you say to Ted Cruz, the self-proclaimed Christian, supporting tank shells fired at crosses. Like, what is that?
We have to defend Christian values, American values. I mean, we should.
All right. So, initial thoughts?
Well, very interesting that, basically, yeah, I mean, it seems like what we have is a different constellation of associations and identifications with like what is American, what is the role of America, what does it mean to be a Christian, how do these relate to one another, and then pattern like the positions that we should have in our foreign policy. And if you see it as a Christian nation in a certain way, then the priority would be like the Crusaders in Urban II's speech. Hey, these Eastern Christians are really suffering under the yoke of some, non-Christian ruler. In this case, it happens to be, Zionist state of Israel, but, it's the same narrative that would be, about the suffering of Christians, say, in Iraq, right, under, kind of a Muslim majority government, or, even though under Saddam, it was always, it was like an Arab regime and they're all Arabic speakers. So, that was a much more secular kind of ideology. But this idea that, Christians are a persecuted people, and that plays into the politics of victimization here in the United States, the sense of grievance that, our country has been taken from us. It's supposed to be a Christian nation and not just a sort of, constitutional country, although we'll elide exactly what we think the relationship there is. But historically, this is supposed to be a Christian nation founded by these Puritans, that's being kind of diluted with immigration. It's being diluted by secularism. It's being diluted by, cultural Marxism or whatever it is that they imagine, all of these things that have taken, political centrality of a kind of Christian community of faith into a subordinate, marginalized position that can't even talk about Christmas anymore because, so it's that kind of sensibility, right? And so you could see he was like, Tucker was kind of like relating it that way. And it's foreign policy then is like, we should support Christians and where they are as a Christian nation. And that's so much like what happened with the Eastern question of the Ottoman empires, the capitulations, all of the special franchises and way of kind of separating the diverse populations of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans and, Middle Eastern, West Asian lands, constantly. The Russian czars, the British, and the French were constantly kind of saying, hey, you can't, our people, we are responsible for them. And so they should have special kind of status that, kind of undermined in many ways the Ottoman state and the possibility of maintaining some kind of multi-religious, multi-ethnic polity. And when it collapsed, nationalism was the only sort of frame under which politics, could be legitimized, and it led to all kinds of horrific genocides and population transfers and displacements, just like we see in other cases, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its collapse with all these like kind of nationalism. And you don't get the Balkans the way the Balkans are without that. So that plays into that kind of, idea is that like we're the dominant kind of colonial, not colonial in the same way, but we're the dominant imperial power. We are a Christian nation. Our affiliation should be supporting and protecting Christians wherever they are, and that gives us a warrant for intervention. But in fact, we don't really want to intervene. We just want to not be, manipulated. So this is like these anti-Semitic kind of sort of ideas and tropes. And of course, you look at the situation, you wonder, well, like who's wagging the tail or the dog? And this is a live question now, like in anti-imperialist and left kind of analysis is like, is it just the aircraft carrier? But yet they seem to, I would argue my solution to this is to say that there's a Zio-American elite network that kind of knits together corporate leaders, Wall Street, in ideologies of Zionism, or with all these tech billionaires and so on. Many of them are Zionist oriented, whether they're Jewish or not, but many are and have a kind of a history of being Zionist, and they're kind of implicated. And so there's such interrelationship between, intelligence, corporate, political leadership across US and Israel, that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just think of it entirely as two separate countries. They are two separate countries, but there's a kind of network that enmeshes them into a Zio-American kind of system. And so, who's is it America's kind of imperial interest that Israel just serves, and so they would have to be subordinate to that? Or is they're a lobby and there's some kind of manipulation and control or distortion of US politics and normal kind of geopolitical thinking for American foreign policy that's being distorted? That doesn't make sense to me, because I don't see it as there's one side and the other, and which one is controlling who. It's this is how Western elites are now working as a transnational sort of class that will exploit, the capabilities of nation states, but themselves are, kind of products of there's even transhumanists now. They want to go into space. I mean, they've got a whole project and a vision of the future for which the Gaza genocide is the laboratory, as Anthony Lowenstein has said, of what's the prospect? Or as Gustavo Petro said, this is what the ultra rich have in store for all of us. So yeah, it doesn't make sense to kind of think about it that way, but they're not thinking about it in that way. So for them, there's America and there's Israel, and there are agents in America who might be distorting America's kind of proper policy. And if anything, there should be Christian supremacist affiliation in US foreign policy. That's kind of how I see what they're kind of thinking about. And that's, counterposed to the neocon Christian Zionism. Okay, that's the other component. So there's an American first kind of Christian Zionism or Christian supremacy, and maybe we'll bring back a little anti-Semitism, but we will, of course, if we're facing the Muslims, be Judeo-Christian then, because that's important. But there's the other kind of, Christian Zionist and a neocon kind of approach to U.S. empire. And that's what that Ted Cruz and all these others, Lindsey Graham and these sort of people, they will definitely use kind of biblical, the in Genesis 12:3, where God promises Abraham, it's before he's Abraham, that, those I'll make a great nation. Doesn't say Israel anywhere, but says I will make it is a prophecy, of what's going to happen with Moses, presumably. That's the way a biblical reader might look at it. But is that I will, bless you. So they're willing to use that to kind of justify. But I think what's really at root for them is U.S. hegemony and supremacy as a special, exceptional nation with a mission to, kind of dominate the world, like the American century said, that it'll bring democracy and freedom and prosperity to the world, but we have to dominate it and we have to be the hegemon. And if that means we have to use our military kind of advantage in endless and ceaseless wars to kind of create it and defend it, that's what America has to, turn itself into a warrior nation, just like Israel. Turning itself, it always was, but even more viciously and crudely into the Spartan fascist warrior nation of unceaseless expansion, unceasing war, and unceasing genocide.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of the other things that are going on with Tucker that you can read through his various conversations and even through a little bit of a longer trajectory of him is that his greatest fear in the world is China. Yes. And he sees China as the key, primary antagonist to US hegemony. And so that leads him to a number of interesting positions. One is not liking the war in Ukraine and thinking that the United States has messed up its opportunity to pull Putin and Russia into its orbit and has actually pushed them into China's orbit.
He's a good Christian leader. What did we do? What a mistake, right?
Right. Yeah. And then with this, I mean, I think that part of it for him to, I agree. I mean, I think that the anti-Semitism thing can't be, because this is part of what you got to earlier on in terms of these different levels of kind of Christian anti-Semitism. And one, of course, is that, the Jews didn't get the New Testament. They didn't understand the gospel. They didn't recognize the Messiah, right? And so his frustration, and it comes out, I can't remember in which conversation most specifically. It might have been one of the ones, but it might have been actually a third one. But this idea that there needs to be a second coming of Christ, and that Christian Zionist notion, right, that we're doing this, he rejects that all as heresy, right? So he sees that, like, no, we've had Jesus, he was our Messiah, and that you all trying to do this weird stuff over here to create to make another is a kind of false Christianity. It is a distortion, right? So there's that. Interestingly, in that interview too with the nun, and I apologize, I'm not remembering her name, but you mentioned the multi-religious, multi-ethnic piety, and you could see a tiny bit of it in that conversation. But her main point is that, like, in the parts in the occupied territories, right, that in Gaza, in the West Bank, and she talks about her time in Gaza as well, that the Christians and the Muslims there live in an integrated fashion. And part of what she pushes back against is any notion that Hamas or any other Palestinian Muslim leadership is fundamentally antagonistic to Christians, But you saw also in that, like, she's talking about the desecration and even some of the building of walls in the settlements and so on in the West Bank, how there's been destruction of sites that are holy to Christians or Christian schools and things like this through this. And so this is the thing that he's trying to kind of gin up, is this kind of Christian outrage at what the Israelis are doing to Christians in the Holy Land. And he plays coy and dumb a lot. I mean, he does his, like, yeah, they're our ally, but we should be getting special dispensation here. Like, this is our project. We're paying for it.
Yeah.
Our people should be, and this is not happening. And so it's kind of a, like, we need to get them back in line politics. And this is why somebody asked if he had shifted to, to being somebody called him a Zionist, and it's like, he's still a Zionist, and he is not expressing an anti-Zionist politic. If you listen closely enough to what he's saying,
right.
it's just this, like, the tail is wagging the dog kind of argument. And I agree a lot with what your analysis is, that we can't really actually think about it solely in those terms anymore. I mean, I do think that the United States is the dominant hegemon, but I do think that you have to think about the integration of these elites and the notion of, it's very difficult to talk about a separate ruling class of Israel and a separate ruling class of the United States, because there's so much integration, and we see it every day, not just among the kind of political bodies, but at the level of the billionaire class and so on. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if there's other things you wanted to get to. There's some stuff, there's some, shout outs we can do in the chat and comments there and stuff.
Yeah, maybe for a few minutes, and then I probably need to go. But
All right.
I just so
Yeah,
much enjoyed discussing these that and I get carried away going off. The problem is as a historian, you always think the details and the examples are really worth it, and they're not always for everybody. And you could just maybe summarize the point, but I always feel like, well, you got to give some
no, I
illustration
appreciate it
of
greatly.
it, but that takes time, and you just go off on a lecture, and so I apologize for that.
No, 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 no. It was great. And I also recognize as somebody who hosts a lot, because I do too, that like when you're on someone else's platform, it's like I've been holding all this in for to let my guests speak for X amount of time. So yeah, no, it was great. Very much appreciated, Adnan, and we'll have to do it again soon. Battle of the Epic Beards, great conversation. Thank you. Shout out to Deculturation. Um, I'm not changing the name of the channel to Unaliving Capitalism to boost views. If the views suffer because of it, then so be it. Uh,
Unaliving, huh?
Unaliving, yeah,
Oh,
unaliving.
unaliving. Okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There's a lot of other good stuff. I'm not going to get to everything in the chat because I do want to give you space to move out. Definitely compost the rich. Thank you, Pancho. I agree. That's a good, it's ecologically sound. Oh, there was one other thing, but I can't remember. But thank you, Adnan. You gave us, I think, so much to think about today. Oh, one other thing that somebody did raise in the chat that I did want to just address quickly. So some people were taking a little bit of umbrage at our use of the term settler and of the idea of, that they don't just settle, that they occupy. And I think that for me, the most important term in a lot of ways in settler colonialism is the colonialism part.
Yes.
But I do think when I think of settler, it's not to pass on any legitimacy to
Right.
the settler. It's just to say that it's a form of colonialism in which people from the colonizing country move in and create settlements, and those settlements then become the basis of their new state that is an illegitimate structure, really, an imposed from the outside structure. And also, I would say, like, occupation as a term, I mean, it has its uses. It's obviously criminal. It's a kind of terrible thing, but it can be a kind of temporary thing. Like, it can be that you're in a war and you occupy a portion of territory for a certain amount of time, and in that occupation you have a legal, under international law, kind of obligation of what you have to provide for people through that, and then you eventually intend to leave. And settler colonial polities and groups do not ever intend to leave. They intend to usually commit genocide, but more importantly, to take the land as their own and displace any other claims to it. And I think that there are some important differences there. And I think that, we could talk about those different things, but I just wanted to say that because I'm not trying to give any legitimacy to people through the use of settler.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if anything, like, it's become a delegitimizing, like, it's even more harsh than the way people typically think of colonialism, because, like, in some ways, the era of direct colonialism has pretty much ended. I mean, this is what's weird and sort of interesting about the Zionist entity, is that it is like basically the last settler colonial project of the West. And that's why I link it so closely with the first, because I think there are unique features to it not being the typical either settler colonial. There's some, because British had settler colony in Kenya. They had people who tried to control, and they controlled the vast majority of the arable land. They were just people from, the British Isles who were part of the, settlement and expropriation of the land from the indigenous African populations. There are other examples of settler colonialism. The French in Algeria, it's a particular kind of colonial control where as Patrick Wolf calls it, it has its own particular features and involves, among other things, the logic of elimination that, and there's different kind of varieties even within that. In South Africa, it was maybe less eliminationist and it was more subordinate, exploit, and then keep separate sort of social spaces and differential kinds of rights. So there was a settler population from Dutch and then later British, and, but they didn't completely, try and displace and eliminate in certain areas where they had farmers. So like earlier Dutch, settlement, where they were farming on the land, they did kind of, get rid of people. But it was kind of something where it was like a small minority can rule over a majority and exploit them for their labor and have them work in the mines and things like that under harsh conditions. So the whole point is, it doesn't legitimate anything to call it settler. It's just to distinguish between forms of colonialism that involved the transfer of populations, often, let's be clear, unwanted, even persecuted populations outside of the nation. They couldn't be integrated. There would have been a demand, and this is very clear that there are commentators from the 19th century, philosophers and policy thinkers in the UK saying, if we don't get rid of these people, I mean, this is the Malthusian kind of idea. If we don't get rid of these people, there will be social revolution, of underclasses demanding, fair wages, rights, etc. You can't kind of have this population. So undesirable populations or surplus populations, i.e. populations made surplus from the perspective of labor, of industrial capitalism and so on, they were exported by these colonizing nation states to new territories. And those exported populations, were given, concessions, support to establish new societies under the umbrella of the colonial power, but to create a new character. And so we're talking about the United States, Canada, much of Latin America, although there are different variations. Again, the plantation economy, created by the colonization, genocide of indigenous populations after they proved themselves very difficult to kind of use as a kind of controlled productive labor force, and therefore then the importation and genocidal enslavement and depopulation of parts of West Africa to create plantation slavery racialized in the kind of new settler colonies of the Western Hemisphere. The convict populations that were sent to Georgia, the convict populations when Georgia was no longer available with the glorious American independence, which is what happens. A lot of these settler societies, colonial settler societies, break away from their kind of sponsors, imperial or colonial sponsors, and create their own republics. All of them become republics. It's not an accident. But so the same with Australia, when they couldn't send them to Georgia, they sent them as colonial settlers in Australia. So what we're talking about is a feature within a kind of world system of exploitation, labor, and control in various forms of capitalism that develop in Europe. And I just want to encourage all listeners. This is a very important and very interesting question that the people raised and that you pointed out as really about different forms of colonialism. I want to encourage everyone to come to first to watch my discussion with Dr. Laleh Khalili that'll come out. It's available right now to patrons, but it's going to come out later today or tomorrow with Laleh Khalili on her article in Jewish Currents, actually, interestingly, history lesson about reviewing a kind of book on settler colonialism, trying to poo-poo the whole concept. This guy, Adam Kirsch. And she does a really good and interesting historical kind of analysis and takedown of it. And to further the conversation about this very important historical and conceptual topic of settler colonialism, I'm having a discussion in office hours live stream on my channel, 5 to 7 p.m. tomorrow. Day after tomorrow, Friday, 5 to 7, August 22nd, on understanding settler colonialism in the world system. So that kind of more global and political economic analysis to understand what is colonialism, what is settler colonialism, what is imperialism, and how are different forms of the subjugation of others part of varying stages and orientations of capitalism. And to do that with me is somebody who's written 2 extremely important articles about settler colonialism that is actually critical of some of the kind of views of those who've established the field and really coined this as the main kind of way of distinguishing between it and like franchise colonialism or other forms of colonialism, the guy Patrick Wolf. I'm having Max Eil on, and he's fantastic. He should be known. I'm sure he might be known to your audience, Max Eil.
Oh, yeah.
He's going to be coming on as my guest for live stream. Come post your discussions, comments in the chat. We like to have a good discussion, and not just with me and my guest, but also with the audience. So we're going to be talking about settler. You got 2 things on settler colonialism coming out, in the next 2 days. Like an episode with Laleh Khalili, and then a live stream discussion with Max Eil. So I invite everyone to come join us and make the discussion better with your comments and questions.
Awesome. Yeah, people should definitely do that. I look forward to both of those. And yeah, Max has been on. We've talked a little bit about that work of his, but not to the
You
depth.
had him
I'm
on
sure
for
you guys.
Al-Aqsa flood.
We did a couple on that. Yeah. I mean, we've done a bunch of stuff with him also on like his political ecology work as well. But
yeah,
we did touch a little bit on the settler colonialism piece and some of his critiques of its use. And I think that should be a really excellent conversation to hear that deep dive with you and he. So, all right, Adnan, thank you so much for this. This has been great. Folks, before you leave, make sure you have liked, shared, subscribed to both of the YouTube channels. Support the Patreons if you have some money available to do that. But more importantly, support the work and just share it. So thanks again, Adnan. This has been great.
Thank you so much.